Welcome students. Today we are going to have a class on a very interesting topic, and that is the interest groups and the new social movements. In the first portion of our discussion, we will be talking about interest groups, and in the concluding portion, we will be talking about the new social movements. First, coming to the interest groups, we would all be very anxious to know what are these interest groups. But before going into that discussion, let us see where can we position these interest groups in the political arena. And when we talk about the political arena, the thing that immediately comes for a discussion is political power. And now we have to locate these pressure groups in this whole circle of political power where actually we can fit in these interest groups. As we know, social groups are very much part and parcel of every society. But some social groups compete with one another to get into the positions of power, and some social groups are limited in their activities and they are only happy with influencing those in political powers and getting their demands satisfied. We will limit our discussion with these two types of social groups. So if the former one is interested in competing with one another to capture the political power, and it has its interest best served by capturing that political power, that governmental position, we can very well classify that group as a political party. As differentiated from the political party, we have the other set of group who are more interested in influencing the political parties or the party in power in getting their demands or interests satisfied. So today our discussion is more or less based on the functions, the role of pressure groups, the kinds of pressure groups, and a comparative study of pressure groups in liberal democratic system and some authoritarian systems. So now we started the academic discussion about interest groups. What are the interest groups? Now, as I said, in the society, there are a wide number of social groups. So a pressure group, as Ziegler has pointed out, can be said to be an aggregate of persons who have some particular or specific interests, and they want to satisfy that interest without putting any of its member in the position of power. Okay, this is very important, that they do not want to become a part of the political part. They are influencing the political. So this is a very important or significant difference between a political party and a pressure group. So pressure groups are basically those who intend to or seek to influence the political system and get their specific interests satisfied by the political system or by the government. So in that sense, their scope of activity is a little bit narrower than that of the political parties. We know that parties, they have to rather think about the entire country. They have a national agenda. If they are performing at a state level, they have a state level of, agenda. At the local level, when they are performing, they have to have a local level agenda. But as far as the pressure groups are concerned, they are not concerned about the entire country. They have a specific interest, for example, an economic interest, an interest related to environment, an interest related to human rights, an interest related to basic subsistence, and they're interested only in that particular demand, that particular interest, and they zealously guard that interest and try that the government does its job by translating their demands into policy decisions. So the scope of function of the interest group is a bit narrower like the political parties, but nevertheless they are really very important and significant in the functioning of a political system. Now when we come to the functions of the pressure group, we will see that they, like the political parties, they also do aggregate interest. May not be at a level which the political parties do, but at a much narrower level, they aggregate the interest. For example, let us think about a trade union. They are looking into the interests of the working people. For example, an economic interest group, they are looking into the economic interest of the industry. So you have various chambers of commerce which look into the specific interests of the industrialists. So you have students' organizations, you have professional organizations, you have working men's associations. So they are not concerned about the entire country, but more about their own specific interest. So at a much lower level than the political parties, the interest groups actually do aggregate interest. The interest groups, as we have seen, they, besides aggregating the interest, the most important job that they perform is interest articulation. Now, interest aggregated must be articulated. Now, articulated to whom? Obviously, it's to the government that the interest group has to make itself heard. The government has to hear the interest group's demand. So, it articulates its demands to the government, which goes into the government as inputs, and governments, up to the government, it filters, it chooses amongst all the demands that are coming into the political system and translates a few into policy decisions. Now, if these policy decisions are not acceptable again the interest groups, they pressurize the government to change or to reformulate the policy decisions. So interest aggregation and interest articulation are the main functions of the interest groups. Now, how do they do this? Now, how do they make themselves be heard by the government? Now, this is done by lobbying. Either this is the most sophisticated way of winning the governmental support, or by undertaking unconventional means. Now, what do we mean by unconventional means is that by organizing strikes, gheraos, bands, demonstrations, protests, distributing pamphlets, they might thus just arouse the governmental or just attract the government that they want these things or their demands to be heard by the government and translated into action. So this is basically the functions of the pressure groups. And now we come to the discussion about what are the kinds of pressure groups. Now, there are various kinds of pressure groups, but for our academic discussion, the scholars have categorized or classified them as associational interest groups, non-associational interest groups, institutional interest groups, and the last of all, anomic interest groups. Associational interest groups are very simple, and you can find the trade unions, the teachers associations, the working men's association, the business associations, which have a formal structure. They have a proper way of functioning and bargaining with the government. They have their interest very much defined, and they know how to bargain with the government, either lobbying or then they or undertaking any other unconventional means, depending upon, of course, the nature of the pressure group. You cannot find any economic interest group going into demonstrations or gheraos or strikes. Now, coming to non-associational. Non-associational interest groups, you might be finding it very difficult to comprehend, but not at all. It is usually formed around ethnic lines, along caste lines, along kinship lines, along religious lines also. So these people, they come together and they feel that their interests are being hampered, so they lobby with the government to get certain policies, reservation policies, or certain benefits from the government. But the most powerful is the institutional pressure groups like the military cliques, the bureaucracy, which are very much inside the institution or the political apparatus, and there they influence a lot of policies of the government. Coming to the last category, the anomic pressure groups, these are spontaneous groups, or if you put it very academically, spontaneous penetrations into political activity, like a sudden reaction towards a policy of the government. The people might not like it. Some environment problem or environment policy of the government sometimes arouses anger amongst the people, and they have mass demonstration or protests, or some policies of the government or some activities, malfunctioning of the government might arouse anger in the people, and they might hold strikes, demonstrations. And these kinds of anomic groups are of very temporary nature. They emerge, and once the reason for their emergence just vanishes, they also vanish. Now we are entering into a very vital discussion about a comparative study of the roles of pressure groups in some countries. Now, if I choose UK, USA, France, Switzerland, and Russia and China, we can easily make a rough estimate of the role and functions of pressure groups by just categorizing the 4 countries as being liberal democratic, and the other 2 being, one being a transitional but more or less authoritarian, and the other being totally an authoritarian country under a single party domination. So if we say that UK, USA, France, Switzerland, they are the liberal democratic ones, we can easily categorize Russia as a transitional country with a strong authoritarian bias under Putin, and China, an authoritarian regime under a single party domination, that is the Chinese Communist Party. So if we just look at the last 2 first, because they are very unique cases. Now, if you look at Russia, and now at the current time, when we have Vladimir Putin as the president of Russia, we know very much, pretty well, that he is a very authoritarian kind of ruler, and he likes centralizing the power, and he is not happy with any systematic opposition to the government. So pressure groups may be there in Russia, but they are not welcomed by the political regime. Though his predecessors, Putin's predecessors, Medvedev, tried under a huge political protest in 2012, tried to introduce some changes, tried to give some concessions to the groups and the parties, but it was really difficult. Actually, it is till today really difficult for political parties other than United Russia, which is the biggest political party and which is the party to which Putin belongs to. Either it is very difficult either for a political party or for a pressure group to exist in Russia without the full-fledged support of the regime. And what about China? Now, China is another unique case, because in liberal democracies, I don't have to go into these exceptions because they have a certain pattern in which the interest groups they actually function. But China is another unique case. Here, if you oppose the government, you end up in a jail. So this happened in 2007. Wu Lihong, he is actually an environmental activist, and he lived in an area where China's Tai Lake, and that lake is contaminated continuously by industrial pollutants. So he raised his voice against this pollution and contamination of Tai Lake's water, and what he got in return is obviously a 3 years jail. Another situation is Rushan nuclear power station, which is being established in China, and people are campaigners, they are against this nuclear project, but again they're very careful, they're treading very carefully, because if they raise their voice, if they pressurize the government to roll back this nuclear policy, nuclear station, or to end this project, they know that they are going to again, like Li Hong, they are going to again end up in jail. So the pressure groups are in a very nascent stage, though there are many pressure groups or interest groups in China, some registered but thousands go unregistered, and they are eagerly waiting to voice their demands. But alas, in China, situation is very bleak. Under the domination of the Chinese Communist Party, you can't make yourself being heard by the government. Now, coming to the liberal democracies like UK, USA, France and Switzerland, you have ample presence of pressure groups. As in case of UK, you have the British Trade Union Congress, the British Medical Association, the National Farmers Union, the Police Federation, and you also have some promotional groups like the Council of Civil Liberties, now it's just called Liberty, Child Poverty Action Group, Abortion Law Reform Society, Stonewall, which is fighting for gay rights. If you come to USA, you also have ample examples of pressure groups which are functioning in USA, whether that is of doctors, of farmers, of businessmen. But if you talk about America, I must mention some very powerful business houses like Microsoft, General Motors, AT&T, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and the Chambers of Commerce and the other business organized groups which are really powerful in USA, and which does a lot of lobbying, the Congress and the committee level when a bill is being drafted or deliberated. But the most important point to mention in USA is a particular lobby which to a great extent determines America's policy towards Israel, and that is the Jewish lobby. When we were students and we were taught interest groups, we were given this as a very bold example of lobbying the senators and in Congress and the influential American officials by the Jews, which in a way determines how America is going to formulate its policies towards Israel and towards Palestine. Coming to Switzerland, Switzerland has a large number of pressure groups, and to be very free and frank, Switzerland is a country of direct democracy, and there you have the system of referendum and initiative, and these pressure groups like Swiss Union of Commerce and Industry, Swiss Business Union, Swiss Federation of Trade Union, Swiss Association of Arts and Crafts, to mention a few, they are very active, and before every referendum and initiative, these pressure groups, they lobby the people, they try to mold the public opinion, and as such, the federal governments and the local those commissions, they always try to consult these pressure groups before going into any drafting of new policies. Now, as far as France is concerned, France also has a number of pressure groups, and like USA, UK and Switzerland, they range from employers association to business associations, to mention a few: General Confederation of Labour, France Democratic Confederation of Labour, Workers' Force, French Confederation of Christian Workers, French Confederation of Management, General Confederation of Executives. These are a few examples of the prominent pressure groups that are present in France. And the most important thing, why I made a difference between the liberal democratic ones and the not so liberal democratic ones, the transitional ones and the authoritarian ones, because any function of an interest group or an effective function of an interest group depends upon the nature of political system. This is very important. What kind of political system is it functioning in? If it's a liberal democratic one, it has advantages. It has its freedom of speech and expression and using various techniques in lobbying the government or bargaining with the government. But if it is like China, you cannot voice your demands. There your effectiveness, your function is very much limited. In Russia too, you cannot voice a lot of anger against Putin. If you do so, then you end up in jail, as the pussycat gangs, those girls who used to sing, and their song had particular phrases which was critical about Putin, were put into jail. So we are quite aware of what are pressure groups, the kinds of pressure groups, the functions of pressure groups, and how these functions differ in different kinds of political systems. We will now move on to from pressure groups to new social movements. Now, what do Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, or PETA, People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, have in common? We have do you have any idea? Of course, there is a commonality. Their purposes may be different, but they have a common factor in them, and that is they are all examples of new social movements. Now, what are new social movements? They are organized groups, but huge groups, and working on a wide range of interests. And that interest might not be a single specific interest, but an universal kind of interest, like environmental issues, like human rights issues, like nuclear disarmament issues. And these movements are gradually becoming a regular phenomena, because they, like pressure groups, also have an agenda to pressurize the government and to get the government do certain things which does not hamper or hinder the progress of the humanity. So these groups, like the Arab Spring, to talk about, it's the recent thing which has happened in the North African countries, which is also known as Jasmine Revolution. And this North African countries, thousands of people, they took to the streets, and they all wanted a change of the regime. So it can be said that social movement sometimes is anti-state, and really they brought about changes, but in a very peaceful way. Now, whether the change is for good or was for bad, that is time to say. But the classification or the category of the movement which happened when we talk about Arab Spring is the category of new social movements. Now we can pretty well come to India, and we will see that the first genre of social movements, struggle for independence under Gandhiji. You have the civil disobedience movement, you have the non-cooperation movement. Before that, you have the Swadeshi movement. These were the first generation of social movements. And in India, we had another test of a new social movement when again, simultaneously, when we were having Jasmine Revolution in North Africa, we had this movement in India, like the anti-corruption movement or the demand for Lokpal and Lok Ayuk. So new social movements, the newness is that social movements of the first genre, they might have some specific kind of agenda. Usually in a Marxian sense, we use the kind of class struggle. But if you look at in case of India, it was a struggle for independence. But in the current genre, we find the identity, the politics of identity is the very crucial element in case of the new social movements. For example, women's movements, that's for identity, caste movement, environmental movement. These are all examples of new social movements. And to give you some specific examples, there are movements that are taking place all over the world. The most important is the Greenpeace movement. And to mention some other, there's the Shahbag movement, a mass movement demanding trials of crimes against humanity in Bangladesh. Then there's the anti-nuclear movement, there's the animal rights movements, there's the LGBT movements. The new social movements are another kind of we can see another kind of technique or tactics or form of pressurizing the government to get things done. So, but its scope of work, its scope of membership is much larger than the pressure group. It is so large that sometimes it is said to be a rainbow coalition, or sometimes it is said to be networks of networkings, because these social movements, they try to connect or link a lot of organizations working for the same purpose across boundaries. And we all know the IT revolution and this social media revolution has made geography history. So it's very easy to establish network all over the world. And when you have established network all over the world, you know that you have that kind of clout in pressurizing the government, whether it is undertaking any environmental project or developmental project which might hamper the environment, like the Narmada Bachao Andolon, the Chipko Andolon, the Silent Valley protest. So these are the new genre of social movements which are taking place in all countries all over the world, and some have linkages throughout the globe, the Greenpeace being the most important of all. So we have looked into pressure groups and new social movements, both intending to pressurize the government or influencing the governmental policies, but interest groups at a lower level, but social movements at much larger level. Thank you.